This is thrilling, and I'm really excited to see familiar faces in the room and also a lot of new faces. Um, and yeah, as Brandon said, Laura and I are going to be chatting. And I know sometimes questions kind of come up as, folks are talking. So feel free to drop those right in the chat. Like, you don't need to wait until the end. And we'll try and incorporate them as we're going along. And then whatever we either don't get to or whatever does come to mind later, we will set aside some time at the end as well for Q&A. So Laura and I are not going to read from our beautiful books tonight. But again, you should totally go pick them up. You can get them from your library, your independent bookstore, anywhere that floats your boat. But I think to kind of kick us off, I would love for Laura to tell us who the heck are you and what's your book about?
Hi, Lacey. Thanks so much to the Writer Center for having us. And love seeing familiar faces and love strangers. It's so weird being a debut author and realizing that people you don't know are actually going to engage with your work. It's so exciting. But who the heck am I? I'm a New York City resident. It's been a very dark and stormy day here, very stormy. But I originally grew up in rural Louisiana. I'm an avid cyclist. My husband and I rode our bicycles across the United States in 2017, and that's really where I decided to go for it as a writer. Because before that, I had a career in finance. Until I was in my mid 30s, I thought I was going to live my life pursuing a career in finance, which is very odd now, and I'm glad that's not what I'm doing. I'm also a debut author along with Lacey. We met in the Poets and Writers Get the Word Out publicity incubator, where we got to work with a publicist mentor and 9 other debuts, 2 of which I see here right now with us.
Hi, Carrie. Hi, Ruby.
And I wrote the book Sister Creatures. It's follows 4 women from the same small town in Louisiana and a supernatural entity that looms over their lives. It's about a lot of things. It's about how we have to deal with our own flawed selves if we have any chance of being there for the ones we love. So Lacey, who the heck are you and what the heck is your book?
Yeah, so I did not work in finance, thank God. I was trying to do some manual math this morning on a sheet of paper, and the numbers did not square up, let me tell you. So I grew up in rural Michigan, and then went to a women's college in Virginia, as a first generation college graduate, which certainly inspired my novel, The Bells, which is about an outsider who's kind of wormed her way into this women's college in Virginia. And once she's there, she realizes that she's to kind of prove herself to this group of girls. And they end up becoming involved in these very sinister games to kind of prove that they're worthy of one another. And it's atmospheric and dark. And has a strong Southern Gothic vibe. And so I'm really excited to kind of talk about and dig into like the origins of horror fiction and horror adjacent fiction and things that genre blend, and kind of how the Gothic has lent itself to a lot of what I think is like fantastic fiction and stories that we have in the contemporary mode. But otherwise, I'm a cat mom of 2 cats. I live in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a pretty boring person other than like having 1,000 books that one day I hope to get to. So, Laura, do you want to kick us off by diving into our first kind of question?
Yeah, I think, okay, so I know we love reading spooky things, horror, gothic books all year long, but the day before Halloween's a really great time to just honor that. So we'll start off with that. I want you to talk, Lacey, about just kind of the choices you made for the genre in blending elements in the bells. I think both of our books are have a lot of realism in there, and they're just using some elements. And I want to know your thoughts about how you created that, what your intentions were, and just whatever you want to say about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I knew, like, when I set out to write The Bells, I knew that I wanted to write a Gothic novel. I really love Gothic fiction in its original 18th century form, and then also kind of all of the permutations since then, all the way up to what we have contemporarily. And so I went into it like I'm gonna write a Gothic novel. And then the campus just became like a natural part of that because it is a very enclosed, isolated setting, which are some of the hallmarks or tropes of Gothic fiction. And I would say arguably of horror fiction as well, right? You have to get your characters kind of away from the world in order to impose this terror or this fear upon them. And so, I think all of my choices initially were really thinking with that Gothic aspect at the front of my brain. How can I make this atmospheric? Like, what kind of situations can I put my characters in that would maybe mirror or mimic? What is kind of at the beating heart of a lot of the Gothic literature that I love. And so I was like very directly and intentionally thinking about that. But I know you had a little bit of a different journey with your book because you weren't necessarily leading with the thought that you were writing something Gothic or even that you were writing something like horror adjacent. So can you talk a little bit about, yeah, like how you approach the writing of your book?
Yeah, well, I'm one of those writers that for years just thought that serious literature meant realistic literature. And so I was failing for probably a decade because what I care most about are the characters, the character relationships, and the very human sort of subjects, family, growing up, all these things. And I just thought the way to get there would be realist fiction, but I kept just getting bored getting through trying to write a novel until I finally um, had a teacher that showed me like Carmen Maria Machado's short story collection and then a Karen Russell essay about how to kind of navigate putting speculative elements into your writing. And so then I tried my hand at it. And I kind of never went back from there. So that's the kind of books I love to read. But also, I also realize I'm not a writer that has a lot of control, or when I try to impose control on my writing, it doesn't turn out very well. And so I kind of just let things happen and let weird stuff show up and then figure out from there how to make it work. But I found that adding speculative elements into my book helps me kind of explore character psychology more than I was able to directly when I was just hitting it on the realist head there. But
Hey, can we like push on something that you said? So you said when you say you don't necessarily like plan for things in your book, are you saying that you're like more of a pantser than a plotter, meaning like you don't lead with an outline, you're kind of writing to uncover what you're writing, or can you kind of like dig into that a little more?
yeah, definitely. I am a pantser. So I tried to outline because I wasn't able to finish a product or a project and it was getting kind of out of hand. But then I am a pantser, and what I found is when I don't put a lot of control on something, weird stuff starts happening. Like, I don't know, sinister triplets show up, or someone's doppelganger just appears. And then you have the choice. You can either delete that very weird stuff, or you can figure out a way to make that work in the book you're writing. And so I did the latter part. But when I was querying agents, I did query this book as a literary feminist novel with horror genre elements, but then you put it out into the world, people start talking about it, and Southern Gothic is what people are saying more than that. And I think that's really cool. I love that.
I mean, that's like, I think, like what's so fascinating, right? Is that like, and this is kind of blurring or blending craft and publishing talk, but I think it's important and good for folks to know that like you will, do everything to create and control these worlds. And you have, up to a certain point, like all of the choices and decisions you're making for that world are entirely within your control. And then an agent enters the conversation, an editor enters the conversation, other people, marketing, publicity, like your cover designer. And then at some point it goes out into the world to readers, and people will start to impose like their own definitions on things or define it or see it through their own lens. And so I think that's really interesting because I definitely, when I queried my agent and then when we went to my editor, on submission, pitched it as Southern Gothic. And in the process of it becoming a book in the world, my publisher actually kind of shifted that focus to like mystery suspense. And occasionally I've seen them even call it a thriller, which I think is interesting. And so I think it is interesting, even like whether you are someone who is like developing something very intentionally, like I want this to be Gothic, or developing something that then becomes Gothic because these elements, these speculative elements are coming in. At the end of the day, like it's going to become its own kind of object separate from anything you intend, which I think is really interesting as writers to think about.
It is. And really quick before we move on, are you a pantser or an outliner or planner, or what's your mode?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I definitely wrote the bells with kind of a few rules in my head. So I was like, I am going to write the type of book that I loved to read as a kid and that I still love to read as an adult, even though I read very widely. I was like, I want to like read or write something that interests me because I also tried to write realism, like painful, like you guys. It was like, I spent 10 years on a novel about two DC lobbyists. Like what is I'm very proud of that book, but it was not a book that represents kind of like what I vibe with. So the first rule was like I'm gonna write what I want to read and lean into my own obsessions. And then I'm gonna, I set a word count goal for myself and I was like, by, this date, I'm gonna have this many words. And then I was like, I'm gonna have fun. So that was like the only kind of imposition I put on the book, and the rest of it I was just writing to like uncover the story. But I'm in a little bit of a different process now because I am working on my second book, which is coming out in 2027, and that I am much having to follow a little bit more of a set structure that I had to create because I am suddenly on a deadline and I don't have the luxury of time at my back with kind of being able to feel my way through the dark room. I have to have a little bit of light in the corner, and I'm making my way through the second book in that way, which has been different from the first one.
Yeah. And even though writing a book, I hear each time you're kind of figuring it out anew, you
Mhm.
still have the experience of having written a book. So I can see the
Yeah.
process definitely changing for my next go round.
Yes, I'll be curious. I want to hear like for your next book. Yeah, what you see ends up evolving in your own practice and your own process. Yeah. Um, but yeah, I would like love to talk a little bit about how but you decided to put your book together, right? How you decided to structure it. Our books are very similar in many ways. I think there's a lot of thematic overlaps. There's a lot of these different horror adjacent gothic element overlaps, right? These dark woods having like this pull and this kind of sense of danger and senses of sisterhood being very present. But not necessarily a loving sisterhood, right? A kind of like sharp-edged, maybe prickly sisterhood. Um, but at the same time, they're very, very different in how the stories are told. And I think a lot of that is due to the structure. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the structure of Sister Creatures and what led you to that structure as you were writing the book and revising the book.
Yeah. So Sister Creatures takes place in three parts, Louisiana, Beyond, and Homecoming. It's a novel in 13 chapters and it spans the first third is in this fictionalized town in Louisiana, based on where I grew up. And then we move out into the broader world. And it does span 30 years. So, what actually happened, I think, is as I mentioned, 10 years of frustration around not finishing a project. And then being in an MFA. So I was at Columbia when I wrote much of this book. I've revised it a lot since then. But what I ended up having were these five individual stories. So I had this woman, Gail, working in New York City who met her doppelganger and Tess, moving to Germany with her family in an unhappy marriage. Um, Olivia falling for her older coworker, Lainey struggling with her little sister, and then I had this odd shapeshifter out in the woods in rural Louisiana, Thea, who shows up a lot throughout my novel in different forms. At the very first chapter, she shows up in the version of a creepy doll. But I had these 5 stories, and I was going to write a book. And I had taken this class on structure where we were studying everything from unlinked story collections to traditional novels. So then you have linked collections, novels and stories, sort of novels with multiple narrative arcs. And it just dissecting so many books in such a short amount of time just kind of gave me a way that I could see making a book with my sort of, I have this math slash puzzle solving slash pattern making brain. Um, and so what I did is I said, okay, I have these 5 sort of snapshots in time with these characters. I know they're related. They came from me. They're all from the same place in Louisiana. And how can I kind of work forward and backwards and make a cohesive arc for them? So once I put my main character Tess and then this woman Gail and Thea, the entity, into a room together, 15 years earlier than Tess's sort of first chapter that I wrote, that's when the book really came together for me. And what's great about that is when you write someone when they're 35, and then you write someone when they're 20, you can completely go back and revise, rewrite that chapter when later on, when they're older, because you know so many new things about them. You've introduced new elements, new objects into the story, and there's this sort of iterative process that was great for me. I mean, it did take a ton of revision. It was a 4-year project to kind of get it just right and just balanced enough. But yeah, I'm happy with that, how it turned out, and I finished a book.
I'm so surprised to hear that because that chapter with Tess as
Mhm.
a teenager is the first chapter in the book. And I had actually read it in a kind of slightly different version when it was submitted to the Story Foundation prize for Story Magazine, because I was a reader and am a reader for Story Magazine. And so it is surprising for me to hear that that actually came after you had written the adult Tess, and that you were kind of like excavating ultimately what is her backstory, but like through a different part of the narrative that then, was to become a huge part of your book, those kind of 2 selves of her across time talking to one another. That's interesting. In the chat, someone asks, the class on structure sounds great, and they want to know, what is it called and is it offered regularly?
It was a class at Columbia that I took through the writer Josh First, who's a really great teacher. And gosh, what was it called? I think Linked Story Collections, Novels and Story. Basically, it was a structure class, and I don't remember the name of it, but it was a Columbia class. But
You
I'll,
have to be in the MFA program
you
to,
do. Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So Lacey, so your book is also very interestingly structured, and I had such a different experience reading it. So much of it, most of it takes place in 1951, 1952, but then we move forward 50 years later. And to me, the book read so differently with those dual timelines than it would have if you had stayed in one timeline. So, I mean, talk about whatever you want to talk about, but I need you to kind of tell me about how you ended up putting that together.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sometimes I'm asked questions and then I like forget what been asked and just answer something else. Yeah, so when I was writing the book, I originally wanted to set it entirely in the early aughts because that's when I was a college student. So I had a lot of course, familiarity with what it was like to be a young person at that time. It was, I was thinking like I'm going to set this like just before cell phones are really spreading, and certainly before social media. Um, and it just wasn't clicking. It just like wasn't, I could feel that was part of that excavation, right? Like I kept writing, I kept trying these characters, I kept putting them in situations, and I just kept like running into like, I don't know, like cement walls in that dark room I was feeling my way through. And so then at some point I was like, I don't know, like I'll try like 1977 because that wasn't like so long ago. And I did that for like a day and I was like, no, this is like, I just keep writing about bell bottoms. Like it was so dumb. And then at some point, I don't know how, I was like, I'm gonna go to the 1950s and just try writing a few scenes there. And it was like, suddenly, yeah, like I'd been given a flashlight and I was like, oh, this is actually like what the story wants to be. And I did resist it because I was not alive in the 50s. I did not want to do research because I don't know, kind of lazy. And it ended up being the best choice for the novel. And actually the research was delightful. So don't let yourself talk yourself out of things that your project might want. So most of the book, as I was writing it, then was written in that 1951, 1952 school year, which made sense because it's a campus novel. It's dark academia. So, it's very firmly set within a certain time period, within the book. So that was like an easy like setting choice for the structure. But then I knew that I did want to see how the characters were dealing with the consequences of their pasts, right? So they make these choices as young women, 17-year-olds, kind of experiencing freedom and autonomy for the first time. And I was like, all right, like, how do they experience those choices differently 50 years on when they have so much more life experience behind them? I had originally only written a few of the women's perspectives. So my novel is mostly centered on Dina's point of view, but there are points of view of the other Bells, the titular Bells, as well as other characters. And the titular Bells who appear in the early aughts, those again were not all there in the version that went to my editor. I had only some of them, the ones I was most interested in hearing from. And my editor was like, well, you can't just pick some, you got to pick all. And she was right. And so it was then kind of a matter of thinking about like what were all of the women, how were they all kind of handling, these very bad things that they did when they were essentially children or teenagers. I don't know, did that answer that question?
That did answer that question. And what's one thing that's really interesting to me is this idea that you resisted what the story actually wanted to be for a long time, because that resonates so hard for me. I tend to, even though I'm pantsing it, sort of have this idea of what will happen, what I'm going to sort of make the characters do as if they're puppets,
Yep.
and they just don't want to do it. And sometimes I still try to make them, and they're like, I guess you technically can make me, but I'm going to reward you by feeling totally dead on the page, and like this will read really contrived. So that was a
And
let.
it sounds like woo woo, I think. Like I feel like before I was working on a project like this, like I would hear writers be like, yeah, and then like the book told me what it wanted to be, or like this character like talked to my ear. And I was like, that's like a bunch of woo woo nonsense. Like I was like, no, 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 like there's craft involved. Like
Mhm.
this is a skill, you're developing a skill. Like tell me what you really did. And this is a craft chat, and yet here we're like, yeah, but actually, like the book did just kind of tell us what it wanted to be, and like the craft in that was getting out of our own way, thinking we actually know everything, and like following like that story's lead, which still sounds woo-woo, but I don't know. I think I view it differently now, having actually done that and experienced it.
Yeah, and maybe the simple non-woo-woo way to say is like keep revising a lot,
There
because
we go.
and then once you weed out the parts that are not working at all, I think the characters have told you what will work.
Right.
Or
That's right.
maybe it's just us, but who knows? It feels, I don't know. For me, yeah, these characters feel as real to me as a lot of my friends and family, which I think is true for a lot of writers.
Yeah, well, your characters are very like I think you do a really great job with character development, and I think part of the joy of having a structure where you're seeing characters at different points in their lives is that you get to really excavate the characters like inner selves in a different kind of way. One that's not necessarily like better or worse than, if you aren't having dual timelines or if you're not seeing characters at different inflection points, but I think it is like it lends itself to kind of understanding those characters on a deeper, almost more intimate level. And I felt as a reader that there were times I like hated Tess. Like I fucking hated Tess. Part of my language. I was like, girl, like get yourself into rehab. I don't know. But I came to understand her a lot more because I got to see her three or four times in different ways in the book. And I think that's true for other characters as well. Um,
Yeah, it's interesting. So with a character like Tess, and you have some pretty, shakable characters as well. I mean, it really does benefit, I found, from looking away from them at times.
Mhm.
Um, because I think you can read someone as frustrating without feeling frustrated as a reader to a
Yeah.
point. But at least I felt for my book, getting away from my main character at times was definitely 100% necessary.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can feel almost too close to our characters at times. Yes. And I
Um, we have a question.
Yeah. So how did working on plot change for us, if at all, when going from realist to speculative slash horror? I've found trying to figure out what happens with horror feels harder than with realism, and I worry about edging into cheese. Ooh, that is a really fantastic question, Ruhi. I'm gonna send that to you first, Laura. I'm gonna put you right up there.
So most of my horror or gothic elements come from this character Thea. And for me, what happened, it didn't necessarily change any plot for me because when I was writing realist fiction, it wasn't this book. It was things that I put into a drawer because that is just not a style that suits me, even though I love reading it when someone is clearly good at it. But how do I do it without letting it edge into cheese? That's actually a really good question because I do think there's a knife's edge between actually scary and just sort of goofy that you sort of have to be willing in early drafts to lean the wrong way, I think, and then um, just let it get better in later drafts. So, for instance, there is this chapter in my book where these cyclists riding their bikes across the country come upon this house that says it's got Mama Prayed scrawled across the front. And that's actually a house my husband and I saw when we were riding our bikes across the United States. But we pulled up to the house and someone walked into the porch and stared at us and we, pieced out from there. But of course, your characters then go into more dangerous situations than you might. But since I didn't have a plan, like seriously, these sinister triplets show up that I brought to my best friends that are my readers and just said, I know this is like really kind of goofy right now, but for some reason they want to be there, and how do you kind of make that happen? So I think it's just this willingness to, for me, not delete stuff early that I know has potential, even though in the moment it's not quite working. I don't know. What do you think, Lacey?
Yeah, it's interesting because it sounds like for you, like you really leaned into the revision aspect, right? Like just needing to like kind of iterate and try things out. I mean, I think horror is really interesting as a genre, right? Because at its core, like horror is about fear and like things that we fear individually, things that we fear societally, culturally, and that changes and that shifts across time, right? And like horror's roots in Gothic fiction. Like Gothic fiction is all about um like the original Gothic fiction, right? Is all about like transgression and these questions around like power and authority, and often like lineage, right? Like are the right people coming to power or in power? And like if the wrong people ascend to power, like what does that mean? And like that has very different implications on an individual and on a societal level, like in the 18th century than it does today, right? Because of how we have kind of shifted our understanding of like what lines of authority and power mean in different like political or social or cultural contexts. And so I think like for me, like I don't know, like I lead with like what actually frightens me. Like what are things that I am scared of? And sometimes it's like one single thing. So like and this is ridiculous, but I'm scared of horses. Like I fucking terrified of horses. And Laura, I know you said you used to like ride horses or train horses. And heard that and I was like, mm-mm, that is not for me. And I know it doesn't make sense, right? But I also knew that I wanted that to be in my book. Um, and that was like a very personal thing I fear that I then gave to one of my characters. And worked it as a plot point at a couple of different elements or at a couple of different stages in the book. I think to then not make it cheesy, right? Like for me, I kind of resolve that potential cheese aspect of like, oh no, the horse, by actually just making it a core component of the plot and like what happens at a few different key moments in the book. Um, I think yeah, I think horror and like what people fear also looks different based upon who they are, right? Like Laura, you probably don't fear horses because you know, might not carry that with you, right? And that's because you've had a different set of experiences around like having worked with horses or um, you know, been around horses in a different capacity. And so I think then for me, it's also like thinking about these fears and like how to connect them to character to make
Hmm.
them a character's fear to like eliminate that cheesy possibility because you can't control what your reader is coming to the book with and the things that they fear, but you can give that to your characters. And then,
Yeah, for me, that's all such great. And it's making me think, for me, usually when a scary element shows up, I know there's a reason. I just don't know in the moment of writing it. So, and a lot of it for me ends up having to do with character psychology.
Mhm.
So, when someone meets their doppelganger, she's really kind of confronting her past in the form of this entity in a
Mhm.
way that she won't confront it if it's just left to her without adding this entity in. And then these sinister triplets that kind
Who
of
also appear in the doppelganger story in a
that's true, yeah, but they're kind of playing or
they're creating a sense
amplifying.
of disorientation, I feel like.
Right. Well, my character's anxiety about being a gossip, telling people stories, and that's an anxiety or maybe a fear I have even about writing,
Mhm.
is we're using our own lives, the lives of people we know, even if we're writing fiction. I mean, it's just not a neutral act. And so, yes, we're bringing our own fears, our own anxieties into this, and like letting these entities kind of amplify that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really great question. Thank you for that. I do want to talk a little bit about, are you okay, Laura, if we talk about point of view? Because we've kind of touched on it a few times.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You know, and our books are each told through multiple points of view. And so I'm curious, um, you know, why did you choose to do that? And kind of what challenges or maybe pleasant surprises did you run into while writing, you know, the story from these different characters' points of view?
Um, yeah, so it was natural for me because as I said, I had these sort of five different characters that had their own stories starting out. So then when I thought about the book as a whole, um, unless actually I did end up deleting an entire character and a character storyline, but that's a whole other story. But once I figured out who was actually working for this book, they were just the natural people to still stay with throughout.
Mhm.
And as I said, I could have written a version of this book that follows my main character, Tess, from when she's a very sort of troubled 20-year-old who feels that her life has imploded, even though thankfully it hasn't. She actually has a journey. But anytime I tried to stick with her too long, she's too frustrating of a character who I love. I'm so proud of having created Tess, but you need to look away from her at times. So for me, it was just more a really fun challenge to try to have these different voices that felt very different. And I'm thinking the hardest voice for me was my character Lainey. It's she's just so nice. She's so competent, she's so kind, and I was doing really well writing these sort of very big attitude, kind of big sense of humor, sort of sarcastic characters that see the world in a certain way, and that voice can kind of carry you through a story very fluidly. At least it does for me. But then I had this challenge of having this character who wanted to be so nice, and I had to kind of push myself in her case to find, I don't know, emotion in the story beyond just having someone's attitude show up on the page. And I think I found maybe more emotion with her because I didn't have that to fall back on. So she has this whole journey with her little sister, and I read this book 20 times and I tear up every time I get to like the end of their journey together. And I think it's because that was a point of view that was more challenging for me to not kind of fall back on the ease of writing a character with some big attitude. Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. I think that the idea that you were kind of propelled forward by some of your points of view because they have like a very like distinct and distinct perspective, but also a distinct voice. But as you said, like, yeah, like an attitude. Like, I think that's so interesting because I think writers are often counseled, like, don't make your characters nice. But like Lainey is, like her, like the embodiment of her character is like she like wants to like do the right thing by her sister and her family, even if that means like that she is kind of in this forced exile. And yeah, so like I think it is interesting that you took this character who is like a very grounded, competent, like incredibly empathetic, like aware character and like put her in friction with a character who has a lot of different like ways that she's interacting with the world that do create more natural friction. And so I wonder if it's that relationship that allowed you to propel Lainey's point of view forward, right? That's interesting though. Yeah.
Yeah, well, with the bells, I mean, you have these six bells that very quickly in the book are their own distinct young women, which I think is such a challenge. I do think
It
that when I was at your book launch that you mentioned, you had even more
is.
bells early
Yeah.
on. Yeah, so talk about your point of view choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just gonna say, we have about, I think, about 15 minutes left. So if folks have questions, additional questions, definitely throw those in the chat. We would love to answer them. But yeah, to kind of circle back to your question around point of view, um, originally I hadn't anticipated writing more than just Dina's point of view and then a point of view of someone in the future um, who I wanted to like be able to reflect back on the things that had happened, while they were college students. But I realized that in the process of writing the book, which does have a large cast of characters, the Bells are very present on the page. That I wanted to represent some of those in the early aughts in the future sections. But also, I wanted to kind of layer in and texturize the book with the points of view of other more marginalized characters. So there is, like, for example, a poor white woman who's called the house mother, and she's kind of the person who's like in charge of making certain that the bells are in the dorm and that they're following the rules and this, that, and the other. And they treat her terribly, like they're absolute monsters to this woman. And they didn't want just there being monsters to be the only thing that we saw about her character. And so it felt really important with her and some of the other characters to give them an opportunity to be able to kind of reflect back what these like horrible girls are doing to them and like how they are feeling and interpreting that. And yeah, it was actually quite satisfying, I think, to like layer in these different perspectives around this central story of this outsider who's just trying desperately in every way possible to fit in with these girls who are forcing her to compromise a lot of things about herself in the process.
Well, I think we're probably going to talk about setting unless we get some
Yeah.
questions. So if you want to hear about setting, that's great. But also, put in your questions. Ooh, we have one. Um, can you talk about your linguistic choices for these books? How would you describe your style, minimalist, lyric, etc.?
Yeah, interesting. Oh, that's such a good question. So this is like a very what I would consider like a question about like some of the things that come later in the writing process, right? And I would dare I say like even like things that come in as part of the revision process, maybe more than the drafting process, is that like sentence level stuff. So I would say the Bells is like very lyrical, very atmospheric on the sentence level side. I think it is, yeah, I don't know. I definitely like to describe things that are like I like to get really into like the descriptions of the setting and in this way that is like lyrical and maybe musical. I don't know, but that feels like a strange thing to answer as a writer, oddly. I don't know, Laura, like how would you describe your own writing?
That's that is, I agree. That's something I have talked about with other people's books and have never even maybe thought about with my own book. Um, I did love, I got a blurb from a bookseller saying it was a mix of dirty realism and Southern Gothic. And I do think like the dirty realism part feels very real. I think I use, um, plain language. I don't feel like a very lyrical writer, but I do really think about sentence choice. So I've trained as a translator for years now. And as a translator, like I know at least on the very tail end, there are so many different ways you can say the same thing and just to sit with each sentence when the book is done and kind of make sure it's as
Mhm.
perfect as I can make it and say it out loud. Yeah, so that's kind of what comes to mind.
But that
I think
comes at
about
the
that.
very end. Yeah, I think
Agreed.
it's hard. I think I did spend some maybe too much time trying to make the sentences sound the way I wanted them to at the beginning of the writing of the book. But then like you
Hmm.
draft a bunch of stuff and it gets tossed out. And so it's you have to like almost like put that aside and just get down the story and then revise the story and make sure that your other components are working together and then you go in and put that gloss of like whatever your sentence style is going to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have another question. It seems that it might be harder to develop a more normal character than extreme types. For me, it is. For
Mhm.
me, it is. And I don't, I mean, extreme might not be the way I would describe any of my characters, but yes, for me, and I think when a writer is, I mean, when a character is making bad choices, it is really helpful for me as a writer to kind of follow those. And yet you want to balance that and not let that be your entire book. So I find it a lot harder to write a normal character. What do you think, Lacey?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question because I think writers often approach characters in two different ways. I think there's like the characters that are like almost like conscious or unconscious stand-ins for the writer, and so it's like this is the character who's like making all the good moral decisions, and they're not very dirtied up, and like maybe they like scrape their knee, but like nothing truly bad ever happens to them, and like that doesn't make for good story, right? Because you have to have conflict for plot to evolve in a lot of traditional stories. And then on the other end, I think there's like writers who are like, and this character, like, she like used to like drown puppies and she's got like 50 tattoos and piercings and she like backed over a kitten with her car today or like I don't know whatever, right? Like whatever you think your most extreme like horrible type of person is. And then I think you risk like losing a deeper sense of characterization for a character where you're just like letting the extremes kind of stand in for personality. And so I think like the trick is to kind of find the balance of character between like, I'm going to have like tattoos be their entire characterization, or I'm going to have them just be so nice as to like not have any, as to not like put them in any situations that they can't get out of. So yeah, I think it depends on the type of writer you are, like to know like what type of character do I gravitate more naturally towards. The opposite type of character is going to be harder for me to write. And for you, that was like the normal character. You like leaned into the extremes. Yeah. I actually, yeah. I think I lean into the extremes a little bit more too. I don't know. I like to make my characters kind of crash together. Yeah. Yeah, characters have to be the perfect mixture of relatable and alienating. I think that has a lot of truth to it. Absolutely. Um,
I'm loving this question about self-care. What types of self-care do you recommend when it comes to nourishing your writing process, since at times it can feel like athletic training?
yeah, yeah. Well, as a non-athlete, let me tell you. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's really having an awareness of my own process and knowing um that it does not like I'm not a good writer when I'm like sitting down and just like forcing myself to go for 3 hour chunks. Like that's just not like I don't feel healthy when I'm doing it. Like my brain isn't as like sharp. And so like I've had to really reflect on my own process and say like, okay, like I'm gonna write for, 50 minutes, and then I'm gonna take like a 20-minute break. But during that 20-minute break, I'm not gonna go on social media because then I'm like
Mhm.
gone for the whole day, right? But it's taken a lot of work and a lot of like very intentional like self-reflection to kind of understand like what I actually need for that nourishment. As I've like been learning more about my writing process. And sometimes it's trial and error, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had to start a 15-minute daily meditation practice that I have kept up with through all of 2026. I mean 2025, and will continue into 2026.
Manifesting.
Yeah. But there was, yes, writing a book is a marathon, and then you get a book deal, and a lot of writers start to just feel really anxious. Like you think it's the thing that's gonna fix everything because it's a goal you've had so long. But in
Just a
reality,
few.
yeah, you're just embarking on something you don't know about. Your publisher's not ready yet. And instead of enjoying it, I just was anxious. And then, like, I threw my back out and couldn't, like, walk. So, anyway, I have been meditating daily. 50 minutes is the amount of time that I can sit just for back health. And then I have to get up and walk. Um,
Mhm.
so long walks and meditation is what does it for me. And then I read, like I read so much more than I write, which is just still my favorite thing. Yeah.
I think reading, like you have to be reading if you're writing. Otherwise, what are you doing? What's something in your book that you loved writing, a scene or a bit of dialogue or a sentence that made you thrilled to create? Hmm.
Yeah. For me, just I love rereading my book and then getting to a line and going, oh, wow, I love that. And sometimes it's just like, I wish I had it up because I'm going to actually butcher the line, but my main character, Tess, midway through is um, talking to this playwright person, and she's living on an a base in Maryland, and he tells her what um stories are. Like stories are just people's stories, and she thinks to herself, yeah, I mean, to me stories are just an inarticulable mess of like shit swirling around nonstop until you struggle to get it out at like a fraction of the complexity. But I don't have the lineup, but when I get to it I'm like, yes girl, I feel you. What about you, Lacey?
Yeah, what did I really there's this scene where one of my characters ends up having she's like forced to drink on an extremely humid day an entire glass of milk like at once. And I have like no idea like where that came from. Except I'm allergic to milk and I'm always like constantly afraid that like one of my food allergies is going to get set off against my will. So maybe again like going back to fears. But yeah, it's like gruesome in a way where it's just like, oh, like who would make someone do that? And then of course like the act of like drinking an entire glass of milk in one go on like a 90-degree day with high humidity is just like repulsive to think about. And I love it. Every time I read that, I'm like, oh yeah, this is gross. All right, let's do a quick lightning round. I think we have like 3 minutes and we have a couple of questions here. So first one, you're both very involved in the literary community. How has that helped your writing?
um For me, I'm wondering how it helps my writing. Anytime, like you can't do this thing totally solo, so just being in community with people is the whole deal.
Yep.
This year, getting a book out, I can say how it specifically helped. I mean, I've gone to a couple of events a week for the entire year, seeing how people do it, seeing how people talk about things, supporting other people's books, and therefore, like, also drumming up a ton of goodwill for mine has not hurt at all. What about you, Lacey?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that like you write your book in isolation, but like you can't have it exist in the world without a community. And like the community is everything. And if you're not like pumping up other writers, then like get the fuck out of here. Like I have like no patience for it. Like it's like you are part of this whole ecosystem. And if you're not willing to like give to that ecosystem, yeah, you'll feel that lack of nourishment in your own soul. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what was the novel that made y'all want to write? Ooh, ooh. I mean, God, I don't know if I have one novel, but I was definitely a super, super deep Anne Rice fan. Um, Interview with the Vampire, that book like changed my life. And the TV show is so good. Excited for season 3. Um, yeah, yeah. I don't know if that made me want to write, but I definitely loved that book as a kid. Um,
Yeah. The book I loved as a kid was Anne of Green Gables, which is hilarious because it shows up in my book as making fun of it so many times, but it's
I did not like
because
that book as a kid.
I loved it, but also I had like a mom who was pretty protective, let's just put it that way, who didn't want me to read the things that I ended up loving later. And so that was one thing we got to read over and over. But yeah, I don't know. Brandon's back on, so I'll stop there, but I stand behind.
Brandon gives a shout out to the Vampire Lestat. So yeah. Um,
Very excited to watch Rockstar Lestat for a season.
I'm like, you guys, so thrilled about it. Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and give a hearty round of applause for this amazing conversation. So many jewels that I hope all of you picked up throughout. And I want to thank all of you for spending a little time from your spooky season to do this. So thank you so much. Again, please, 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 please buy these 2 wonderful books. The links are in the chat. And I wish you all a great evening, a safe Halloween, and we'll see you around here at the Writers Center. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all so much. This was so much fun. Happy writing.
Thank you.
Brandon, I forgot to ask, do we just like hang on or do we Zoom needs like a post-event green room? This is how have they not done this yet? Uh,
Bye.
Well,
Brandon, are we supposed to log off too?
it's what you want to do. I always try and wait a little bit because I always like to give a nice little thank you so much. This was a great, but I'm gonna go ahead and close this out.
Okay,
And I
I'm gonna take a quick pic of us, can I?
Sure.
Yes.
All right, 1, 2, 3. I realize this could be a screenshot, but it's not. So there you go.
Yay. Well, thank you, Brandon. This was great. Laura, this was so delightful. There was a point where I was like, oh, it's like almost time up. And so
I know. I was like 20 minutes after, I was like, okay, no questions yet. And then it's like 8 o'clock. But I could have talked to you for 2 hours, and I'm glad we have another event together.
Me too.
Thank you, Brandon. I so appreciate this.
Yes, this was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes.